Okay, welcome back to the channel, guys. So today we are going to talk about jugular venous pressure, right? Okay, so before we move on to the jugular venous pressure, a little bit of basics, right? So I want you all to have a basic idea about the anatomy of the heart. So here we're going to focus mainly on the right heart, right? So the right atrium, the right ventricle, and the left atrium and the left ventricle. And I also want you all to take note of the pericardium, right? Because we will see why that is important today in our discussion, right? And the other thing, when we consider the jugular venous pulsation and the jugular venous pressure, here we are talking about the vena cava, right? The superior vena cava mainly, right? So we know that the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava will bring blood into the right atrium, right? So our focus today is going to be on the superior vena cava. So here, you all know it goes into the brachiocephalic trunk, right? Both the left and the right, okay? And then it gives the internal jugular veins, right? And then the external jugular veins, right? And then we have the subclavian, right? The subclavian. So our focus is on the internal jugular veins. This is the vein that we use to measure the jugular venous pressure, right? Okay, so let's start, guys. What do we mean by the jugular venous pressure? And we are going to measure the pressure changes, the changes in the pressure in the internal jugular vein whenever there is any change within the right heart, right? Whenever there is any pressure change within the right heart, that is going to be detected here in the internal jugular vein. And that is what we are looking at, okay? Right, so let's start off. We will imagine, right, that the blood has now entered the right heart, right? And we will start off from that point. So initially, guys, what are we going to have? We are going to have the right atrium contracting, right? The right atrium is going to contract, right? And if we know this is the tricuspid valve, right? The tricuspid valve. And the tricuspid valve is going to be open during the contraction, during the systole of the right atrium, right? And here, the right ventricle is going to start receiving all this blood. The important point to know here is, guys, initially, as the right atrium contracts, right, this pressure generated within the right atrium, right, is going to be transmitted via the blood that is in this venous circulation. It is going to be transmitted to this internal jugular vein. And because of this, now we will draw the graph here, the graph of the JVP. So this is basically the jugular venous pressure plotted against time, right? So what we're going to see is as the right atrium contracts, this elevated pressure is going to be transmitted to the IJV, the internal jugular vein. So there is going to be an increase in the pressure, right? This is what we call our A wave, right? This is the first step, right? Okay. Then the next thing, after initial contraction, after the systole, what is going to happen? The right atrium is going to start relaxing, right? So let me draw that here, somewhere here. The right atrium is now going to start relaxing, right? Okay. And as the right atrium is relaxing, guys, what is going to happen? As the right atrium is relaxing, right, this chamber starts dilating. The chamber of the right atrium starts dilating this way, right? And the valves will be closed, right? The chamber starts dilating. And what is going to happen? This dilation is going to increase the volume within the right atrium. Therefore, there will be a gush of blood. There is sort of like a suction of blood, right, from the superior and the inferior vena cavas into the right heart. Because of this, right, the pressure within the internal jugular vein starts dropping, right? The pressure within the internal jugular vein starts dropping. So let me draw that in a different color, right? The pressure here starts dropping. So I will draw that in this red, right? Right? This is what we call, guys, this is the X descent, okay? The X descent. Now, so I hope you all are clear with this right atrial systole and the relaxation. Now we will move on to the ventricle, right? So next we have the right ventricle, right, which begins contraction. So here, let me draw this again like this. Now, I will draw the contracted state like this, right, just to signify that the right ventricle is now contracting, right, and here, right, like this. So, what is going to happen here, guys? The right ventricle starts contracting, and here we have what we call the tricuspid valves, which will be closed shut during this contraction, right? Okay. Here, During this initial contraction, guys, the pressure in the right ventricle is so much, right, that these valve cusps or the valve leaflets start slightly bulging, right, towards the right atrium, right? This is during the initial contraction, initial ventricular systole. The pressure is so much, the pressure generated is so much that the valve cusps, right, they bulge slightly, ever so slightly towards the right atrium. And this generates a slight increase in pressure that is transmitted to the internal jugular vein, right? This slight increase in pressure, you can put it in a dotted line, sort of, a slight increase in pressure, right? And this will be detected here, right, as just a slight elevation in the pressure, right? A slight elevation in the pressure. So this is what we call the C wave, okay? The C wave. Okay, then, now, here, let us draw our pericardium. We cannot forget the pericardium. The important point I want you all to remember, guys, right? There is, now the pericardium has multiple layers, right? We have to talk about the serous layer, the visceral layer, right? And there's the parietal layer as well. So we're not going to discuss the anatomy of the pericardium today, but what the basic thing I want you all to understand is the pericardium, no matter if the heart is contracting or relaxing, the pericardium usually likes to retain its shape, right? So what happens is when the ventricle is contracting, guys, the pericardium, it still tends to stay, right, in its original shape, right, in its original shape. So this will create a pocket of space. So whenever the ventricle is contracting, whenever the ventricular myocardium is contracting, it creates a pocket of space here, right, between the pericardium and the ventricular wall, right? This space increases, right? When this space increases, guys, now we are coming to our next wave in the JVP. This space creates an open space for our right atrium to start dilating, or the right atrium going into diastole, right? So this pocket of space, our right atrium, starts expanding into this pocket of space, right? This entire portion is our right atrium, right? This is our right atrium, and now our right atrium has received a little bit more space to expand and accommodate and receive more blood, right? Okay, this increase in the space causes a pressure drop. Increase in the space in the right atrium causes a massive pressure drop, and it allows a lot of blood to be brought into the right atrium, right? So this is what we are going to see as our next wave. I will draw it in green, right? Here we have a massive drop, right? What we call the X dash, okay? The X dash, okay? Right. Then guys, now what are we going to get? We are going to get a continued relaxation of the right atrium, right? While the tricuspid valves are closed. The tricuspid valves are closed shut, right? So what are we going to get, guys? The blood. Now, the blood starts pooling into the right atrium, right? I will start coloring it in, put some green dots. The blood starts pooling in, and eventually there is a very momentary congestion of blood within this right-sided venous system, right? Due to this happens only as long as the tricuspid valve is closed, right? The moment the tricuspid valve opens, we are going to see what happens next. But just momentarily, until these tricuspid valves remain closed, right, there's going to be a slight pooling of blood that causes a little bit of a pressure elevation, right, within the internal jugular vein. So this is going to be our next wave here, right? This is what we call the V wave, right? Now, so why does the V wave happen? With continued relaxation of the right atrium, there's going to be pooling of blood, right, within the right heart and the venous system. So because of that, we are going to have an elevation of the pressure as blood builds up, right? Then guys, finally, what is going to happen is blood will build up like this. And then eventually this tricuspid valve opens. The tricuspid valve opens. Now, what I want you all to remember, guys, as soon as the tricuspid valve opens, the atrium does not immediately begin to contract. What happens initially, for the initial few microseconds, we have what is called a passive flow, right? This is called a passive flow. That means the atrium is not contracting. However, the blood is just trickling down, right? The blood is just trickling down into the ventricle. Sorry, this is the contracted ventricle from our previous diagram. So let me adjust that, right? Yeah. So blood is going to start trickling into this ventricle, right? So as the blood starts trickling in, guys, now we know there was a huge pressure generated here. This was our V wave, right? Now this pressure starts reducing, right? Reducing. So this is what we call, right? So the pressure will start dropping in the internal jugular vein, and this is what we call our Y descent, right? This is our Y descent. Okay. Now, so what is going to happen next? We are going to come back to our A wave. So initially there was trickling of blood from the right atrium to the right ventricle. Then that was the passive flow. Then there is an active component in the systole. The active component of the atrial systole is the contraction, right? This atrial myocardium will begin contracting. It will contract to actively push whatever remaining blood into the ventricle. And that is, we are coming back to our A wave, which is the atrial systole, right? So that is the basic concept of the JVP, guys, right? Here, just a few points I want you all to remember about the JVP, right? If the jugular venous pressure is more than 8 centimeters, right? As we measure it, if it is more than 8 centimeters, this is generally one of our primary differentials here is congestive heart failure, guys, right heart failure, okay? And the next thing, we can have conditions where there is an absent A wave, Now, when do you think we see an absent A wave? Now, what did the A wave signify, guys? The A wave signifies right atrial contraction. So if the A wave is absent, what does that mean? The right atrium is not contracting properly. What is one of the most common conditions? I want you all to remember atrial fibrillation, right? Atrial fibrillation. In atrial fibrillation, guys, we will not see the A wave. Right? Then there's another type of wave, guys, what we call the CV wave. What is this CV wave? The CV wave is, guys, a combination of the C and the V. So what do we mean by this? Here, we do not see the X descent. No X descent. Instead, what we see, these two combined together, the C and the V wave combined together, right? So what do you think can cause this? When there is no X descent, this is seen in a condition, right? We will discuss this later in valvular heart disease. There's a condition called tricuspid regurgitation, where this tricuspid valve is regurgitant and there is backflow, right? So when there is backflow, we cannot see this X dash wave because we cannot see the relaxation portion, right? So because of that, there is a continuous rise in the pressure. So the C and the V waves are seen as one large wave, right? So that's about it, guys. That's the basics for jugular venous pressure, right? There are multiple conditions that we can diagnose using the jugular venous pressure. But for now, this is the basic introduction. So hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and catch you guys in the next one.